In 2011, a geologist in West Java was not looking for ancient ruins. He was mapping earthquake fault lines. That was his job, finding places where the ground might break. What his instruments found instead was a place where the ground had been built. The subsurface readings beneath a forested hilltop did not match volcanic geology. They matched construction. And when 4 independent scanning technologies were aimed at what lay beneath that hill, the data they returned described something that should not exist. A layered structure older than Göbekli Tepe by 13,000 years. Older than the Egyptian pyramids by 20,000 years. Older than anything the established timeline of human civilization has ever acknowledged. The site is called Gunung Padang, the mountain of enlightenment. The chambers the instruments detected have never been opened. The answers are still inside. And the question is, why no one has been allowed to look? To understand why Gunung Padang matters, you need to understand what it is being compared to, and why that comparison is so difficult for mainstream archaeology to absorb. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey was already the discovery that broke the timeline once. Excavated beginning in 1995 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the site consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing 18 feet tall, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate relief images of foxes, snakes, vultures, and bulls, arranged in precise circles and fitted into sockets carved directly into bedrock. The construction required quarrying limestone from nearby ridges, transporting multi-ton blocks across uneven terrain, carving them with extraordinary precision and erecting them in carefully prepared foundations. All of this without wheels, without metal tools, without domesticated animals capable of hauling weight. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest layers at roughly 11,600 years old, around 9,600 BCE. That date was a serious problem, because at that point in history, according to everything the standard model of human development said, the people alive in that region were nomadic hunter-gatherers, small bands moving seasonally across the landscape, no permanent settlements, no social hierarchy capable of organizing large-scale labor, no institutional framework for feeding and coordinating a workforce over decades of construction. The model that every university taught said civilization followed a predictable sequence. Agriculture first, then permanent settlements, then social hierarchy, then religion, then monumental architecture, arriving last as the product of everything that came before it. Göbekli Tepe demolished that sequence completely. It proved that monumental architecture and complex symbolic thought existed before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before every development that was supposed to be a prerequisite for building anything on that scale. Schmidt described it as a cathedral on a hill built by people we thought were primitives. For the archaeological establishment, Göbekli Tepe represented the furthest point the timeline could be pushed, the oldest known monumental structure on Earth, the hard boundary of what human beings were capable of before the developments that supposedly made civilization possible. It stood alone at that boundary for decades. The capstone of prehistory, the line that said, "This is as far back as it goes." What made Göbekli Tepe so destabilizing was not just its age. It was what its existence implied about the people who built it. They possessed astronomical knowledge. Their carved symbols encode information that 3 decades of analysis have not fully deciphered. The site was not built quickly or casually. It was expanded across centuries, maintained across generations, and then at some point around 8,000 BCE, deliberately buried. Not abandoned, not left to collapse. Carefully, intentionally filled with thousands of tons of soil, with larger stones placed specifically to shield carved surfaces from crushing damage. The people who built Göbekli Tepe understood what they had made well enough to want it preserved. They sealed it, as if they intended someone to find it later. That behavior, that level of deliberate forward thinking, is not what the standard model predicts from Neolithic hunter-gatherers. And yet the evidence for it is sitting in the archaeological record, measured and documented and impossible to argue away. Göbekli Tepe was the discovery that forced archaeology to admit the timeline was wrong. Gunung Padang is the discovery that forces the question of how wrong. Because what the instruments found beneath that forested hilltop in West Java does not push the timeline back by a few centuries. It does not push it back by 1,000 years. If the data is accurate, it pushes the beginning of monumental construction back by more than 13,000 years beyond the site that already broke everything we thought we knew. The man who found it was not supposed to find it. Danny Hilman Natawijaya was a geologist working for Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency. In 2011, he was sent to the volcanic highlands of West Java to map seismic fault lines. The region sits on one of the most tectonically violent zones on Earth. His job was practical and specific. Find the places where the ground might break, assess the risk, map the data. Near a small village called Karyamukti, roughly 120 kilometers southeast of Jakarta, his instruments picked up something that did not belong in a fault line survey. The subsurface readings beneath a forested hilltop showed density signatures, layering patterns, and geometric regularity that did not match volcanic geology. Collapsed ancient volcanoes produce chaotic, irregular subsurface profiles. What Natawijaya's instruments were reading was not chaotic. It was ordered. And when he aimed ground-penetrating radar deeper into the hill, what came back would consume the next several years of his professional life and ignite a scientific controversy that has not been resolved. What makes this stranger is that the hill was never truly hidden. People had known about it for over a century. In 1890, a Dutch colonial officer filed a report about stone structures on a hilltop in West Java. In 1914, a Dutch archaeologist named Nicolaas Johannes Kram documented terraces made from upright volcanic columns, classified the site as megalithic, and moved on. After that, Gunung Padang was largely forgotten by formal archaeology for 65 years. It sat in the jungle, visited by local Sundanese villagers who had always considered it sacred, treated as a curiosity rather than a subject of serious investigation. In 1979, a group of local farmers stumbled across the overgrown ruins and alerted authorities. Archaeologists arrived. What they found on the surface was genuinely impressive. 5 artificial terraces cut into the hillside, bordered by stone retaining walls, accessible by a staircase of 370 ancient steps rising 90 meters at a 45-degree angle. Each terrace was covered with hundreds of prismatic andesite columns, hexagonal in cross-section, naturally formed by volcanic cooling millions of years ago, but clearly arranged and positioned by human hands. The individual columns average roughly 1.5 meters in length and weigh approximately 250 kilograms each. Some exceed 600 kilograms. There are roughly 50,000 of them. To put that number in scale, if those 50,000 columns were laid end to end, they would stretch for approximately 75 kilometers. That is 47 miles of volcanic stone moved by hand up a hillside, without wheels, without metal tools, without any of the mechanical advantages the conventional timeline says should not have existed yet. Pottery fragments from the surface dated to around 2,000 years ago. Indonesian archaeologists classified Gunung Padang as the largest megalithic site in Southeast Asia. Remarkable, ancient, but firmly within the conventional timeline. Extraordinary in scale, but not in implication. Nothing that challenged the standard model. That assessment held for decades. Because everyone who looked at Gunung Padang looked at its surface. Natawijaya looked underneath. And what the instruments found when they were pointed not at the terraces and columns visible above ground, but at what lay beneath them, is the reason this site has spent the years since alternating between scientific sensation and institutional suppression. Because the surface of Gunung Padang, as impressive as it is not the discovery. The discovery is what was already there before the surface was built. Between 2011 and 2014, Natawi Jaya's team conducted one of the most comprehensive subsurface surveys ever performed at an archaeological site. They did not rely on a single technology. They used 4 independent methods operating on 4 different physical principles, all aimed at the same question. Ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface structures. Electrical resistivity tomography to detect density variations in the material beneath the hill. Seismic tomography, using controlled shockwaves sent through the hillside and measuring how they returned, to build a 3-dimensional picture of what the interior contained. And core drilling to extract physical samples for direct laboratory analysis. 4 technologies, 4 different ways of reading what is inside that hill, and they all returned the same answer. Gunung Padang is not a surface-level terrace complex built 2,000 years ago sitting on top of a natural hill. It is a layered structure extending 20 to 30 meters deep into the hillside, and each layer is older than the one above it. The team identified 4 distinct construction phases. Unit 1 corresponds to the visible terraces, dated between 2000 BCE and 1100 BCE, consistent with conventional estimates, uncontroversial. Unit 2 lies directly beneath. More intricate stonework, dated between 6000 BCE and 5500 BCE. Already older than most textbooks allow for complex construction in Southeast Asia, but not yet at the level that breaks the timeline completely. Unit 3 went deeper, and this is where the physical evidence becomes very difficult to explain away. The team found columnar rocks arranged in precise horizontal rows. That detail matters because andesite basalt columns only form vertically in nature. It is one of the most reliable rules in geology. Lava cools and contracts vertically, always. Finding those columns laid flat in organized parallel rows means someone placed them there deliberately. Between the horizontal columns, researchers found consistent layers of what appears to be a mortar-like binding material, roughly 5 centimeters thick. Mortar requires intention. It requires knowledge of material properties. It requires someone deliberately mixing a compound and applying it to hold stones together. Natural geological processes do not produce evenly spaced adhesive layers between volcanic columns. This layer dated to between 7,900 BCE and 6,100 BCE. And then there was Unit 4, the deepest layer, the foundation of everything above it. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from within this layer returned dates between 25,000 and 14,000 years ago. The last ice age, the Paleolithic era, the period when every textbook, every university course, every point of archaeological consensus says that human beings were incapable of building anything more sophisticated than temporary shelters from bone and animal hide. The people alive during this period were, according to the standard timeline, at least 13,000 years away from building Göbekli Tepe. But the instruments were not finished. The electrical resistivity tomography detected high resistivity anomalies at specific locations within the structure. In those exact same locations, the seismic tomography detected low velocity zones. When those 2 signatures overlap, they indicate one thing: voids. Empty chambers, and the researchers estimated these cavities could be up to 15 meters long and 10 meters high. During one drilling operation, the team's drill punched through solid material at 7 meters depth and entered a zone where no core samples could be recovered. The water being pumped into the borehole to cool the drill disappeared. Not some of it. All of it. 32,000 liters drained into the hill and never came back. When the research was challenged and the paper retracted, the retraction addressed the dating methodology. It did not challenge the structures. It did not challenge the chambers. It did not challenge the layered construction confirmed by 4 independent methods. Something is inside that hill. That is not interpretation. That is measurement. To understand what Gunung Padang might be, you need to understand what the world looked like when its deepest layer was built. 25,000 years ago, sea levels worldwide were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. That is nearly 400 feet of missing ocean. and that missing water had to be somewhere. It was locked in the ice sheets covering large portions of the northern hemisphere, and its absence from the oceans exposed an enormous landmass that geologists call Sundaland. Sundaland was not a collection of islands, it was a subcontinent. When fully exposed during peak glaciation, it connected what is now the Malay Peninsula to Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and Bali into a single continuous tropical landmass, roughly twice the size of India. It sat on the equator. It was threaded with massive river systems draining toward what is now the South China Sea. It was covered in dense tropical forest, rich in fresh water, rich in wildlife, capable of sustaining large human populations across an enormous geographic range. Modern humans had occupied this region for at least 50,000 years. Homo erectus reached Java over 1 million years ago. That is an almost incomprehensible span of time for human societies to develop, to accumulate knowledge, to build and lose and rebuild again across generations that left almost nothing behind because almost everything they built was at sea level. Then the ice melted. Starting roughly 18,000 years ago, sea levels rose in 3 catastrophic pulses that together drowned Sundaland almost entirely. The first pulse struck around 14,500 years ago and raised sea levels by as much as 16 meters in just 300 years. That is the height of a 5-story building consumed by ocean within a single human lifetime. Coastlines that had existed for thousands of years vanished within generations. Villages disappeared. Agricultural land went under. Everything built near the water's edge was erased. The second pulse struck around 11,500 years ago. The third around 7,600 years ago. Together they created the Java Sea, the South China Sea, and the thousands of islands that make up modern Indonesia and the Philippines. An area larger than the modern Mediterranean seafloor was swallowed in less than 12,000 years. Every flood myth in Southeast Asian oral tradition. Every legend of sunken kingdoms and drowned worlds. Every story passed down through generations about a time when the land was larger and the sea was further away. These may not be myths at all. They may be memory. The direct transmission across generations of people watching their world disappear beneath the water in real time. If a civilization existed on Sundaland's vast lowland plains, it is now under the ocean, almost entirely unreachable with current technology. We have mapped the surface of Mars in higher resolution than we have mapped the floor of the Java Sea. Systematic surveys of these submerged continental shelves for structures older than 10,000 years have barely been conducted. The only evidence that could possibly survive above the waterline would be structures built on high ground, on hilltops, on volcanic ridges that remained above the rising tide as generation after generation watched the world they knew disappear. Places exactly like Gunung Padang. And consider this detail. Less than 30 miles from Gunung Padang, in a nearby cave, archaeologists found bone tools dated to 7,000 BCE. Crude, simple, exactly what the conventional timeline predicts from that period. If the community living practically next door was still working bone, who was building the sophisticated layered structure on the hilltop above them? The answer some researchers propose is that the builders did not come from next door. They came from below, from the lowlands that are now the ocean floor, carrying knowledge developed over thousands of years on a continent that no longer exists. What the builders left behind is not only structural, it is encoded. The Sundanese people who have lived near Gunung Padang for centuries noticed something that formal archaeology initially dismissed. The number 5 appears throughout the site with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. 5 terraces, 5 surrounding hills, 5 rivers encircling the complex. The basalt columns are predominantly 5-sided. Stone surfaces across the site are adorned with clusters of indentations, arranged specifically in groups of 5. In Sundanese cosmology, the number 5 carries deep, sacred significance. It represents the 5 cardinal directions of their traditional worldview, the 4 compass points, and the center. The presence of this number encoded repeatedly across the architecture, the landscape, and the decorative elements of the site is either the most extraordinary series of geological coincidences in recorded history, or it is evidence of a deliberately constructed symbolic system connecting the built structure to the surrounding landscape in ways that required abstract mathematical and cosmological thinking to design. That level of thinking is not supposed to exist at the dates the deepest layers suggest. Then there are the acoustic properties. On the lowest terrace sits a large andesite block the Sundanese call the batu kunci, the keystone. When struck, it produces a deep resonant tone that carries across the entire valley. Other stones across the site produce different pitches when struck. One researcher documented a single stone capable of generating 5 distinct tones depending on the precise location of impact. Whether these acoustic properties were intentionally engineered into the stone selection and placement, or whether they were discovered and then deliberately incorporated into the site's ritual function, remains unknown. But the Sundanese have been striking these stones for centuries, treating them as instruments of communication and as a means of connection to whatever the site was originally built to house. The deliberate burial pattern is the detail I find most difficult to set aside. Each construction phase at Gunung Padang appears to have been deliberately buried before the next one was built on top of it. Layer upon layer, each one sealed and preserved, the builders of each new phase covering what came before as if they understood its value and wanted to protect it, while building something new above it. The deepest layer was buried by the people who built the layer above it. That layer was buried by the people who built the layer above that. Across potentially thousands of years, the same behavior repeated. This mirrors exactly what happened at Göbekli Tepe. Around 8000 BCE, the people who maintained that site did not abandon it and walk away. They buried it, carefully and deliberately, with fill material placed specifically to protect carved surfaces from damage. They sealed it as if they intended it to be found later. 2 sites, separated by more than 5,000 miles, both consisting of massive stone construction, both deliberately buried by the people who created them. That is either coincidence or it is a pattern. And if it is a pattern, the question it raises is one that conventional archaeology is not currently equipped to answer. Why would people build monuments specifically designed to be found by someone else thousands of years in the future? Then there is the connection that deserves serious attention and rarely receives it. The hexagonal basalt columns at Gunung Padang are nearly identical in composition and form to the stones used at Nan Madol, a mysterious ancient city built on 92 artificial islands off the coast of Pohnpei in Micronesia. That is more than 4,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. Same stone type, same impossible construction legends in both cultures. The local tradition at Nan Madol says 2 brothers levitated the stones into position. The Sundanese tradition says the entire complex at Gunung Padang was built in a single night by supernatural forces. 2 sites. Same stone, same legends, 4,000 miles apart. In October 2023, Natawajaya's team published their most comprehensive findings in the journal Archaeological Prospection. The paper presented the full results of 4 independent scanning technologies, the layered construction data, the chamber signatures, and the radiocarbon dating from the deepest unit. It was the most detailed scientific account of Gunung Padang ever committed to a peer-reviewed publication. 5 months later, the journal retracted it. The stated reason was that the radiocarbon dates had been obtained from soil samples rather than from artifacts directly linked to construction activity. This is a legitimate methodological concern in archaeological dating. Soil carbon can migrate. Organic material in soil does not always date the construction it surrounds. The criticism was not fabricated. But here is what the retraction did and did not challenge. It challenged the dating methodology. It did not challenge the structures. It did not challenge the chambers. It did not challenge the mortar-like binding material found between deliberately horizontal columns. It did not challenge the 4 independent scanning technologies that all returned the same picture of a layered structure extending 20 to 30 meters into the hillside. The geophysical data was not retracted because the geophysical data cannot be argued away by questioning how soil samples were collected. Not a single member of the 12-person research team accepted the journal's conclusion. The authors called it censorship. They maintained that the retraction addressed a dating methodology debate while leaving the physical findings entirely intact. Something is inside that hill. That conclusion did not change when the paper disappeared from the journal's database. What changed was the institutional appetite for further investigation. The Indonesian government designated Gunung Padang a National Cultural Heritage Site in 2014. That designation was presented publicly as protection and recognition. In practice, it functions as a barrier. Invasive investigation of a national cultural heritage site requires government approval at a level that has not been granted. The chambers detected by 4 independent technologies have never been opened. No camera has been lowered into them. No artifact has been recovered from them. Whatever is inside those voids, whether empty volcanic cavities or the most significant archaeological discovery in human history, remains sealed and unstudied. Consider what that means in concrete terms. Göbekli Tepe was first excavated in 1995. Klaus Schmidt estimated at the time that less than 5% of the total site had been uncovered. Decades of excavation later, that figure has barely changed. The discovery that already rewrote the timeline of human civilization is 95% still buried, and Göbekli Tepe at least has an active excavation program. Researchers are present. Work is ongoing. At Gunung Padang, the percentage of what has been physically examined is closer to 0. The scanning has been done, the mapping has been done, the data exists, and none of it has been followed by excavation. None of the chambers have been entered. None of the deepest layer has been physically exposed and studied. We are standing outside a locked door. The instruments have told us something is on the other side. 32,000 liters of water drained into it and never returned. The electrical resistivity and seismic data triangulate its location with precision, and the door has not been opened. This is the pattern that stays with me. A site whose physical findings remain unchallenged. A retraction that addressed methodology without touching the structures. A heritage designation that prevents the investigation the structures demand. And a scientific establishment that has moved on to other questions while the chambers of Gunung Padang sit sealed in the Indonesian highlands, waiting for someone to decide that what is inside them matters enough to look. The mountain of enlightenment has been patient. The question is whether we will be. Danny Hillman, Natawijaya, went to West Java to map fault lines. His instruments found something that should not exist. 4 independent technologies aimed at the same hill returned the same answer every time. A layered structure, sealed chambers, construction dating to a period when humans were not supposed to be capable of it. The deepest layer has not been excavated. The chambers have not been opened. The floor of the Java Sea, where Sundaland's lowland plains now lie under 120 meters of water, has never been systematically surveyed for what might remain down there. Either the timeline of human civilization is wrong, or someone built on that hilltop during the last ice age sealed what they made with extraordinary care and left it there for whoever came next. The mountain of enlightenment is still there. The chambers are still sealed. The question is not whether something is inside. 4 technologies already answered that. The question is what we are afraid to find.